You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. The mystery and history that surround the legendary monarch King Arthur can often confuse, befuddle or bamboozle anyone attempting to understand it at first glance. Where was Camelot? Was there a round table? Is he Cornish? In fact, is any of it based on real events? Thankfully for us, Mark Olly's lifelong obsession with Arthur has seen him unpick the wheat from the chaff to enable us to locate the real Arthur, the real Merlins, and everything else in between. His book pulls no punches in telling us the real Arthur. In fact, he wasn't even a king. But before that, as always, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, competitions and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as usual. Mysteries and Monsters is across all social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. And don't forget, you can visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for episodes, news, and Mysteries and Monsters merchandise. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Mark Olly now leads us on a quest through time in the Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur.
Mention the name King Arthur, and many would already have an image in their minds or a reference to some aspect of this story. Be it his relationship with Merlin, Glastonbury, ladies in lakes and the Round Table, many of us think we know something about Arthur. Yet to say we know his history is a befuddling mess would be an understatement. Is there any historical evidence that exists for this legendary alleged monarch? Thankfully for us, Mark Olly has done the hard work and moved mountains to pull apart the fables and stories to find the real King Arthur. In his new book, The Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph and Arthur, Mark shows us the light. Mark, welcome.
That's a fantastic introduction. Thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Sincerely hope I do show you the light.
Well, as we were joking beforehand, often I get a lot of books, Mark, and people these days, I'm very fortunate that some people send me them and some I purchase myself.
Ooh.
This is a weighty tome, to say the least. One of the few books I've recently purchased that could be close to this, ironically, was another book about King Arthur that I found in a charity shop in Barnard Castle a couple of years ago, which was absolutely pristine. It was this beautiful hardcover medieval collection of the Arthurian legends, and it was phenomenal, and it was a £5, and it looked like it had never ever been out of the bookstore. It was immaculate. So where on earth did you find the tenacity to keep going? Because, as I said, 500 pages, my friend, most people would be flagging at 3.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've had a while to do it. When you say 500, actually, I think it's 488, but don't worry, I'm not going to split hairs. Well, it took a mere 45 years to get this thing into print. It's managed to see off goodness knows how many notebooks, a considerable number of books of library proportion, a BBC computer followed by an Amstrad computer, followed by at least 7 laptops of a modern kind, and probably a couple of towers as well. It's seen off in that time. So it has taken a while to get it to where it is. It's seen off numerous publishers as well. I've had quite a few of them turn around and go, I can't possibly publish that. That's a career ender. And I've had all the usual excuses, it's too long. It's, don't know if it's history or mythology. And, I'm sorry, we don't do that type of book. All the usual sort of fob offs. But I kept going. I persevered, and once I'd done Crystal Skulls and Human Heads with Philip at Flying Disc Press, I thought, well, why not approach somebody who does flying saucers with something that's as uncomfortable as the truth about Merlin, Joseph and Arthur? Because if you think about it, these publishers are going, well, we can't do that because, it sinks Tintagel, it sinks Glastonbury, it sinks the Winchester Round Table without trace. It does all sorts of really bizarre things, moves Arthur to a different geography, different time and place, all that. Well, I thought, well, if you've got a publisher that's willing to talk about little green men and flying discs coming down and landing on people's back garden lawns, then he's really not going to care about anything too radical to do with King Arthur. And sure enough, that and the fact that it took me 55 hours to format it into his format, and also a couple of radio shows a bit like this one where I said, I really think Philip should take this book, and they ended up ringing him up going, you'd be daft not to take this book. So 3 days after I did the last one of those, of course, he signed me up for the book. But I don't think he regrets it. I really don't. I mean, it's come out, as you say, it's brilliant. It's big. That was his idea to go big. The hardback is spectacular. It's very large and open format and easy to read. And once he got into it, I mean, Philip sent me a lovely email and he just said, I think it's one of the best books I've ever done. So I thought, coming from a publisher, that's not bad. And I mean, I'm not expecting to, it'd be nice if I do sell millions of copies straight away. That'd be superb. But it's one of those books that's still going to be selling the same number in like 10 years.
Yeah.
Or 15 years or 20 years. It is going to be the book for the 21st century. So I'm going to get an early advert in here. Anybody that's into Arthur, you need to dash out and get this thing, because it will change the way you view Arthur. I was going to say, you mentioned in the introduction, is Arthur real or not? I suppose we should get that elephant out of the room to begin with. I set off thinking that there were chances are he wasn't, and I've ended up firmly believing that in fact he was real. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yep. So as you touched on there, Mark, I know as a young man you discovered this love. What is it about King Arthur and the mythos that bit you at such an early age that it stayed with you for the best part of 5 decades, mate?
I started off at the age of about 14 with an amateur movie society, Warrington Cine Society, which meant that I had my hands on a camera so I could actually film stuff. And I thought, I'm going to have a bash at doing a sort of up-to-date version of King Arthur. We'll see where it goes. So I did this thing called King Arthur Seasons of the Mind. It's about half an hour long. It's on Super 8mm film. And it was just this idea of somebody that got transported into the future when he's the only human being that's there. And then all the powers that you find behind the scenes kind of in Arthurian legends start to bestow these gifts on him. So he becomes like the new Arthur, and then he gets catapulted back to his own time, and that's kind of where it ends. So I did this movie in 1977, and I thought, there's more to it. There's a lot more to it than this. I only skirted. I did the kind of, Geoffrey of Monmouth and all that, kind of slid over the top of it, Lamort Arthur and all that sort of stuff. I read all the stuff that was handy, and I thought, this is in itself, it's a modern rendering of something that is clearly much older. Lamort Arthur's about, 1400 years after Arthur lived, and we've got, no, it's not actually, it's about 1,000 years after Arthur lived. And then you've got Geoffrey of Monmouth, he's about, 600, 700 years after Arthur lived. I thought this is too far removed. So I got hooked. People say that once you get into the legends, you get hooked. And then just over the years, I've kind of tumbled over so many Arthurian connections. It's even there in the background of Star Wars and things like that. And I was a great Star Wars fan in the 1970s, and it kind of taught me where all this was coming from. Right the way through me doing television with Lost Treasures, we still did stuff on Arthur in that series. It's always been there. I'm just really pleased that it's finally come out. So I was 14 when I started it, and I'm now sat here with the book in front of me, and I'm 60.
I think, personally speaking, Mark, for me, the thing about King Arthur is, as I said in the introduction, it is such a befuddling mess, because I think what the average person could tell you about King Arthur, we can essentially rip up and throw out. And I know, as you mentioned in the beginning, the thing about this is that there are so many places and locations and certain aspects of places' history that are so intertwined with this connection with Arthur, or this inserting themselves into the legend of Arthur. Because, first of all, we need to stop calling him a king, because he wasn't. And this is one of these aspects that, when you look at what people would know and the whole mythos that surrounds him, basically, if you're of a hardy nature, then you're prepared to have your entire worldview in regards to Arthur and his entire history thrown out the door, because the vast majority of it is medieval romanticism, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what we now see as the modern Arthur, you can blame the Victorians for that, because the Victorians, in all their various revivals, did unspeakably strange things to the legend. They just blew it out of all proportion. If you go back to medieval times, they're being a bit naughty with it, and they are kicking it around a bit and expanding it and moving it, and there's loads of vested interests in there. But the thing with that was, back then, people had to have a basic understanding of the story. So if you were trying to tell a story about Arthur and you got some of the existing details wrong, then the people that were listening to the story wouldn't believe it. Now, in some cases, those people were kings and queens. So you had to basically get the gist of it correct, although you could expand it, you could add things to it. Go back to Arthur's day, and actually he's this, sort of brutish northern Welsh chieftain who's a warlord. He's probably not a king, because he's working under Melgwyn Gwynedd of Wales, so he's known as Dux Balorum, which is Duke of Battles. He has 3 wives, he has 7 sons, all of whom are dead before he is. It's a gritty, hard-hitting kind of character we're dealing with. And as you said, the medieval people romanticised that, and the Victorians took that even further. But you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's still elements. There's still elements inside those stories that you can trace back to what material we originally had, which is mostly Welsh. A lot of it's in saints' lives. A lot of it survives from after Arthur's time. But logically, if you think about it, nobody was going to write about him when he was alive, because nobody knew who he was. Yes. And he wasn't really that significant. And then the next culture to come after his culture were the Saxons, and they hated his guts. They're not going to mention him. They're not going to give any glory to him. In fact, if anything, they want to bury him, because he was the reason they couldn't get into various parts of Britain. So really, it doesn't get going till you get sort of the Vikings and the Danes and then the Normans. It doesn't really pick up pace till then. But it's not completely disappeared in terms of a historical thread. Professionally, I'm an archaeologist. I'm used to digging through layers, and that's basically what I've done. I've just gone through layers. But like you say, it is going to upset some of the purists. But then again, if they're purist and they're a bit scholarly, it won't upset them quite as much as, if you're expecting sort of Martin Bormann's Excalibur, you're definitely not going to get that here. That's not what this is. Or, that whatever that last Arthur film was that looked like something from Assassin's Creed, But even, I've got to say, even those stories have got a thread, a recognisable thread. But no, this book actually, if anything, it's harder. It's more gritty. Let me just read you something off the back cover of here. Just a little statement that really sort of sums it up. It says this: Merlin becomes one of an ancient line of Pythagorean scholars and political visionaries. Joseph of Arimathea, a religious dissident fleeing persecution and death to far-off foreign shores. Arthur, a hardened, womanizing battle leader who loses his entire family and culture to war and eventually natural disaster. Now, that's the real story. That's very 21st century. Do you know what I mean? It's very BBC News at 10. It's once you get into it, people will get the gist of it. It's very easy readable as well. I must say that. Don't be put off by its size. The format, you mentioned in what you was saying, it is difficult to wade through it. It's a bit like pea soup. But what I chose to do, that's the word Polychronicon, is put it in chronological order.
Yes.
So that kind of unmesses it. When you get it actually coming at you in the order it would if it were a complete story, it's very readable. You know, you can see how it all fits together, and, you know, it's got a beginning, a middle and an end, and it kind of leads forward. You know, you can see where it's going. So please don't be put off by the size. And it's not in any way academic. It's an easy read. You know, there's not thousands of footnotes and numbers that refer you to some obscure thing at the back of the book. And, you know, there's none of that. It's all there in the text. You just read it as you go through it.
Yes, and I think it would be amiss of me not to pick up on something you were saying there, Mark, because most people have this idea that Arthur was Cornish or lived in Cornwall, but the historical documentation, as you refer to there, would say no, he was a northern Welsh-based chap, and it's one of those things I've learnt more. I've probably learnt more about Arthur, especially reading this incredible book, over the last 5 years than everything I knew before that, really. Oh, wow. Because I was one of those people who had this idea of Arthur, very similar to someone else you've written about in the past, Robin Hood.
Yes.
I think we're too focused on these romanticised Victorian melodrama versions of history that they were very keen on releasing and promoting, Mark, over the years, to be unaware of everything. And when you start to look at certain aspects of Arthur's modern version, you can begin to pick holes in it without really doing any kind of scholarly research, because there are certain things that make you scratch your head and think, I'm not really too sure about that. So obviously one of these is all to do with where he was based, because, as you say there, because of the time period he was sort of 5th, 6th century, 7th century Britain at that time is what it was, then most people around the Saxons ended up revering Arthur as some kind of sort of hero. And it's very interesting, as you mentioned there, that certain cultures tried to ignore him and hope it went away. But clearly there was a germ of something that fired up certain people, probably due to his nature and his ability on the battlefield, Mark. Yeah. That instilled him in these early cultures, that they kept these stories alive around their campfires or through those dark winter nights when they had to entertain each other. That no matter what happened, as most legendary heroes, you can't crush hope.
You've hit the nail on the head. You have, in essence, you've hit the nail on the head. For the Welsh Celtic Britons, he was a hero. I mean, that's that. That's how he ends up, you know, migrating, if you like, from Wales down to Cornwall into Brittany, and from Brittany into France, because it's the Celtic world. It's the ancient Celtic world. And they really wanted to hang on to him. Like I said, the Saxons tried to bury him, but then when the Danes and the Vikings turn up and they bump into the Welsh Britons, the Danes and the Vikings have got heroes like Beowulf. You know, they're already talking about heroic warriors. And these Britons come along and they go, hey, well, you know, you really need to hear about Arthur. Here's the stories of Arthur. And it's this, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the Danes and the Vikings hated the Saxons, and the Welsh hated the Saxons. So basically what you get is, by about 600 AD, there's actually this kind of slightly Norse hero poem that's been dated by language back to probably just going into the 600s, that has the very first ever written mention of Arthur. And it's the Picts, it's the Scots, it's that culture and the remnants of the Old North that start then revering him, you know, and it becomes this unbroken line. By the time you get to sort of the 700-800s, you know, the Vikings, the Danes must have been, like you say, around campfires, absolutely singing his praises. They must have been looking back to a golden age, you know, when Arthur was around. That's the background. The Welsh Viking, you know, the Britons and the Normans, that's the background of Geoffrey of Monmouth. You know, I think his dad was a Norman and his mum was a Welsh Briton. So you look at that and you think, well, no wonder he, you know, did the Kings of Britain and stuck Arthur in, you know, because by that point it's a big deal. And when you start to look at it in chronological order, developments like that begin to tumble out. You can see where it's going and where it's coming from. I mean, the whole Viking Danish aspect, without you knowing where the geography was, without you having a starting point, you'd really struggle to see the connections. But that's another thing about this book. It very, very, very quietly takes ground, and that's some of the ground it takes. It fills the gap in between the end of Arthur and then what comes next. And I don't think anybody has managed to do that quite as convincingly as the book does. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah. Well, he was clearly a very powerful person, because obviously one of the first aspects of the whole Arthur legend that I became aware of was this belief, Mark, that the spirit of Arthur, or Arthur, would be reincarnated or return from beyond, wherever he'd gone to protect the Welsh at certain parts of their history from invaders and some of the historical invasions that had gone on, and the sort of smashing of the nation as it was throughout the sort of medieval period and into the sort of 12th and 13th centuries, when you had various English kings taking a shine to certain parts of it and wanting to put castles on every square mile of the country, it would seem.
And coincidentally claiming to have dug up his body at Glastonbury, which is complete nonsense. But
Precisely. Yes, we'll deal with that that kernel of nonsense in a moment. But
okay.
So that for me has always shown that there's always been this, and that's when I started to think, well, why would the Welsh be so obsessed with somebody from Cornwall, Mark? Because I'm sure being parts of the overriding Celtic nation, similar yet not the same, clearly they would have some kind of cross-pollination of heroes and myths and things, as you would often find in certain cultures that have some kind of basis of connection. So that for me was the first time I began to think, I'm not really sure what we're told is what the actual history is here, because that was the thing that made me think, well, why would the Welsh hold this man in such reverence then, if he's from Cornwall, with the greatest of respect? Cornwall's beautiful, but so is Wales. So it's remarkable for me, because Wales is a country full of myth and legend, which once again is one of those places which I think, even in the modern era, unless thankfully in these modern times, more and more stories and collections about Wales and its legends and its history and its myths are coming out to a wider audience, which is long overdue as someone with a deep soft spot for that particular part of the United Kingdom. So it's interesting how, as we go through the ages, so many English kings try to sort of bolt themselves into Arthur's history, be it a relation. They utilise the stories of Geoffrey of Monmouth. They create these historical remnants that they claim to be tying them to this story. And obviously, as you've touched on, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, one of the key aspects of this, which the cynical person would suggest was nothing more than a tourist ploy to fleece gullible peasants out of their hard-earned wages at that period of time, if they did even earn any wages, probably just their corn, Mark, was this whole Glastonbury story.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it begins with a major problem, because obviously Edward I and his Queen Eleanor have got a problem that the Welsh are revolting. That's what they're doing. They're going into revolt against the English, and they're claiming that their King Arthur is going to rise and lead them into battle. So at that point, Edward conveniently needs a body. At the same time, Glastonbury Abbey had burnt down. So the monks are sat in Glastonbury thinking, well, we've got, bits of a legend in our library. I wonder if we can tie all this together and, make a few bob and get the abbey done up and get some pilgrims and all the rest of it. So they put the two things together. They miraculously find this body, which is quite clearly archaeologically from the Glastonbury Lake Village culture, which is, Iron Age, possibly older. They dig it up, this body buried in a log coffin. Yeah, I don't have any doubt at all they did. But a lot of the descriptive parts of it, like, it's got arms. It's got King Arthur's arms painted on the top. That's nonsense, because arms didn't really come into use till medieval times. So that's 400 years after his death. It's got this strange lead cross in there that they made a copy of, which then disappeared. And the language on that's medieval. So that kind of blows that a bit. It's claimed that there was still hair and clothing on the bodies, this, that, and the other. Yeah, there might have been, but nothing tangible to say that was definitely Arthur. So, and the Welsh didn't believe it either. They're like, no, this is wrong. The English can't. There was a saying, the English can't tell an ox bone from the bone of a man. That was what they said about it. They said, this is clearly not right. But it is interesting that the current Prince of Wales, who is about to become king, has Arthur as one of his middle names. So don't believe for a second that this has gone away. You're talking modern day. It's still, as you pointed out, it's still affecting people in positions of power now. I mean, presumably before he ends up getting crowned, I might actually send him a copy of this book. I'm sure he'd find it interesting. I'll send it him as a crowning gift maybe and say, there you go. That's what your middle name means. That'd be a great publicity stunt, wouldn't it? That'd be brilliant. He'd probably write back and go, I've never read such a load of nonsense in all my life. But no, it's brilliant. Honestly, it's brilliant. Carry on. Next question.
So it shows us even 1,000 years ago, Mark, people were very aware of the power of propaganda to make unruly peoples bow before them with this kind of stealing of a legend. And I think that's when you can come from it, because when you look at his early history, Arthur is depicted warts and all with his lifestyle and the way he is, and he's remembered as he was as a fierce, brave warrior, a man who took no prisoners, both literally and figuratively. He was renowned for his power on the battlefield, which is obviously why his name was the Duke of Battles, because of his prowess. So it's when we get to when he gets this kind of renaissance with Geoffrey Monmouth and other writers at that point, where they start to create this superhero and we start to get these elements of the story. I think one of the interesting aspects of this for me is the whole Excalibur story. Oh yeah, because now I might get this wrong, Mark, but there are two parts to this, so bear with me. Bronze swords were sort of created in a sort of mould. So when the bronze had cooled, they basically had to pull it out of what was essentially a piece of stone, which is, I would presume, I might be wrong, where this whole sword in the stone story comes from, that he had to pull it out, because that's how you got a bronze sword.
Yeah, you nailed it. That's what it is. Good.
So, I did pay attention in history class. So, the other aspect of all this is, of course, though, during those particular battles, bronze isn't much good when you're coming up against people with iron. So I would imagine that, as many kings and dukes and warlords had, this Excalibur, or whatever it was called, or whatever it was purely decorative, ceremonial. It was for showing off. Whereas I would imagine, being the battle-hardened warlord that he was, he would have had a far more useful arsenal when it came to actually taking things to battle.
And he does. You're absolutely correct. He does. There's enough evidence out there to say that the bronze sword is ceremonial, because in the Welsh account of his crowning, which took place at Chester, there are 3 or 4 other nobles that come to that, all of whom already have bronze swords, and they're referred to as swords of office. So it's called Calderbolg, which means the flashing or the shining one. Yes. And that's the sword he gets. By the time he's going into battle, though, as you rightly say, the iron swords would just go straight through that like butter. So it's known then that Excalibur, the true medieval concept of Excalibur, is iron. It's an iron sword. And funnily enough, fast forward to the Crusades, you got Richard the Lionheart arriving at Jerusalem, and one of the guys keeping a journal of what he's doing says, and Richard the Lionheart sends the iron sword of King Arthur in as a gift to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So they knew where it was. They knew what it was. There's a brief description of it there contained in that account. And I reckon that the monks at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem have got this rusting iron bar stuck in the back of a cupboard somewhere and haven't got the foggiest idea what it is. So if I ever get around to doing this as a TV documentary or as whatever, I'll phone them up and ask them. Because, it's not the kind of thing you throw away, if it's a gift from a king. So you never know, it might have survived. But that's where the iron sword ends up. And the idea of throwing swords into lakes, when the owners died, that actually carried on, believe it or not, right through the medieval period.
Mm.
So it didn't just suddenly come to an end. Yes, it's a prehistoric thing. It goes all the way back to the Bronze Age. But for thousands of years, they were still doing it. They were still throwing them into water. Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't be unusual for that to happen for the bronze sword because nobody else had the right to wield that other than Arthur himself. The iron ones, the practical ones, like you say, I mean, he also had a shield, he had a dagger, a ship, a horse, a dog. He's got all this list of equipment which appears in the book. Because I did go to great pains to try and track it all down. And there is, like you say, a number of weapons, some of which are up to date. They're, 5th and 6th century technology, which is what he would have required.
Mm. I mean, obviously, that is a long-held tradition because I know recently there was a young lady in Scandinavia 3 or 4 years ago who found this incredible Viking sword in a lake, I believe. I'm trying to think which country that was in, Mark. But that shows you how well spread that particular tradition was, that regardless of cultures, people would still discard swords in such a way as if to be honouring someone.
Yes, there was this thing in the past, going back into the ancient world, for water burial. Yes. So, that was a kind of an accepted thing. So you could water bury literally anything. You could water bury, a sword, a human being, pottery, timber. We look at that and we think in terms of offerings. As archaeologists, we look back and we see all this gold and metal and all sorts of stuff that's thrown in. Most of it's Bronze Age or Iron Age. But technically, the Iron Age doesn't really come to an end till the end of the Roman era. Mm. So if you were really, really, really picky, you could say, okay, the last Iron Age culture, proper Iron Age culture, Romano-British, is Arthur. Well, that brings you right up to he only died in 539.
Yeah.
So that's very late. That now is tipping into what archaeologists are referring to as early medieval. Well, to be honest with you, they were still chucking swords into lakes and stuff like that right up to the Crusades and beyond. And if you look at Viking culture, you say, oh, Vikings, they were still writing Icelandic sagas up to about 460 AD, 1460 AD.
Yeah. So
1460 AD is like, oh dear, you're heading towards the beginning of Elizabethan and Tudor times. It's getting very close. So the kind of the nice, neat kind of high school labels, for prehistoric, Roman, medieval, whatever, Dark Ages as it used to be. All these nice, neat little boxes don't exist in the real world. Things carry on. Things continue. I think I mentioned, actually, there's a section in the book that covers Templars. The Templars were beggars for carrying stuff on.
Yes.
They got hold of ancient traditions and just carried it on.
Yeah.
Even in the Grail in Parsifal, von Eschenbach's classic work, he specifically says the Templars are guardians of the Grail. So that gets covered in the book as well. That's the Joseph of Arimathea bit, obviously, because you need to know that. So that's in there.
Well, this is one of those things. When it comes to the Grail, Mark, I'm still amazed that there are so many people who believe it's this kind of jewel-encrusted goblet that's priceless. Whereas I think one of the only modern versions of any kind of Grail mythos that seems to treat it as what it should be, which is without wishing to sound dismissive, some kind of run-of-the-mill stone dish or cup or something was Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, because obviously there is the scene where they find the Holy Grail and the bad guys are tasked to choose the right one, and they go for the most exquisite one.
Yeah, there's that lovely line in it where I think it's Indiana Jones says it should be the cup of a carpenter.
Yes.
Brilliant. Genius. Well, yeah, actually, when I started looking at what the Grail was and I started trying to make sense out of all of that, I think I came up with 27 different versions of the Grail. And it's quite easy to define what the Grail is, especially the ones that Arthur was looking for, because it's either something associated with the Last Supper. So, you've got all the dining tableware, bowls, you name it, cups, everything, or something associated with the crucifixion. But it has to have an association with one of those two for it to really qualify as a proper Grail. And then, like you say, there's a number of possibilities in that, which I do go into in quite some detail in the Joseph section. But when you say jewel encrusted goblets, there is one. I have to say this. It's the Holy Chalice of San Isidoro, or the Grail of San Isidoro, or the Chalice of Donna Urraca, it's known as. It's in the basically the Crusaders brought it back to Spain as a gift from the people that eventually took charge of Jerusalem. So it comes from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where there was known to be two of these cups. One was known to be the cup of Christ, the other was the cup of the apostles. And funnily enough, there are two of these stone cups that made it across to Spain. Now, the irony is, I think it was 2012, there were a couple of scholars from Spain out there in the Middle East, and they're going through, of all things, Islamic shipping receipts. And they actually found the medieval shipping receipts for these cups. So there's almost a complete unbroken line for these cups going right the way back to there being a cup in the temple of some sort, which then ends up in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which then in Crusader times gets transported. You can kind of follow it. So, there is actually a cup, which I suppose you could regard as the Grail. But I also go to great pains in the book to say, anything with that word Grail or Graal, which is a Viking word for a stone bowl. Yep. It's any vessel that serves a company, a gathered collective of people, with something that is grain based and involves wine. So that's it. That is the literal definition of a Grail. So if you really wanted to be pedantic, you could say, well, every single church that's got a communion set has technically got a Grail, because that's what that is. Admittedly, they do it the other way around now. The bowl or the plate tends to contain the wine to drink from, and the chalice doesn't contain the grain-based material anymore. But the way it used to be was there was the bowl, and you drank or you ate from that bowl. And that goes all the way back to prehistoric times. They've had, things from thousands of years BC. They've had Neolithic pottery that has a sort of a grain-based porridge flavoured with an alcoholic substance, and they can analyse that from the pottery. So you're now talking about this tradition, which has been handed down from prehistoric times through Babylon, goes to, Abraham, where Melchizedek comes out of Jerusalem and does the bread and the wine thing. Then it goes to Christ. Christ reappropriates it after it was used in Egypt, 1,000 years before for them fleeing. And then it kind of works from there, and it slowly grows into this idea that there's, the Grail, the chalice you can look for, then it becomes communion, and then eventually communion kind of explodes. It doesn't become a churchy thing anymore. It's all over the place. And that unbroken thread, it's a prehistoric tradition. It's there for thousands and thousands of years. And the book touches on that. It's got that kind of thread in it. And it's a spiritual thing because, when they started farming and started producing bread in large quantities, and when they started fermenting stuff, which initially was honey, and then very, very quickly they did it with grapes, and they started producing this alcohol. These were the basic things you needed to keep yourself alive, to stay alive. Yeah. So absolutely, it's Yeah, it's the closest ancient ritual still in existence, I think, that relates directly to whatever the concept of God a person has is. It's got no boundaries, it's got no religious limitations, it's all over the place. So that section, the bit on Joseph, which actually comes before Arthur in the book because of chronological order, it's important that you know that before you kind of get into the Arthur period, because that's the stuff that Arthur would have known.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was about to dive into Joseph because obviously when you look at this on the surface, people might think, well, what has Joseph of Arimathea got to do with Arthur? And obviously this is to do with the fact that as a religious dissident, he had to flee his homeland with a group of other people, some of them disciples, some of them relatives of Jesus at that particular period in time, I believe, Mark.
Yes.
And they ended up settling here. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, when Joseph arrived, he, I think, was arrested and interred for a few years because of his beliefs or whatever?
Well, it was more to do with the fact that it was a bit weird because he ends up landing on the Wirral, which at this point is a bit of a wilderness. It's known as the wilderness of Wirral. So he lands there, does the bit with the holy thorn tree, creates a site where they can have a small chapel, worships up there, and all the rest of it. And then he decides that he realizes he's on something that resembles an island. So it's got the ocean at one end, and it's got two rivers all the way down it. So he thinks, right, I'm going to go onto the mainland. Bad move, because when he goes onto the mainland, he goes into the territory of this Welsh king called Crudel. Now, Crudel's never seen a bunch of people like this in his life. He's got no idea who the hell they are, and he knows there's trouble coming from Rome. So he's going to suspect these people because they're Romans. They look like Romans. They come from Roman territory. They're speaking Roman as far as he's concerned. So he's looking at them and he's thinking, are these friends or are they enemies? So until he knows who they are, he kind of puts them under house arrest. But it takes a couple of years to find out who they are. So in that time, they get an opportunity, if you like, to get really ground in North Wales. And they basically start the first church, they plant the first Christian church anywhere in the world. Somewhere around about 52 to 54 AD, this church is planted. And it still is. I mean, the Catholic Church is the second church because that's after 60 AD, 62 with Peter and Paul. So if you go knock on the Pope's door and you say, what's the oldest church in the world? He will say the British Celtic Church because it came first, potentially 10 or more years before one was planted in Rome. I was going to say at that point, probably most people's heads have gone and exploded because, if you really want your head to explode, if you go and check out the Pope lists, it's great because the first Pope after Peter and Paul is Pope Linus, and Pope Linus's mum is British.
Yes.
So he's half British. He's a half British Christian Celt. So by the time you start looking at these important minor details, it kind of changes the way you look at things. As I said, this book takes no prisoners.
Absolutely. So people would then say, well, how does this tie into Arthur? What connected Arthur to it? For many people, they would be confused as to what the connection is, Mark. But obviously, in your book, you clearly explain why.
Well, yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got North Wales, so along comes this character in, 52 to 54 AD. Wallop, he plants the first church. Well, that means that area, the sort of Old North, if you like, has now got claim to the oldest church anywhere in the world, and Christianity begins there. That's the planting point, if you like. But at the same time as this is happening, the Romans are also slowly moving their way up the British Isles looking for somewhere to put their capital. So they decide they're going to park the capital in the same place because they put it at Chester. Now, by the time you start to see how that develops, so the church is developing there, what eventually grows to become potentially the capital of the Western Roman Empire, which is Chester. It's 11 acres bigger than any other fort they ever built. That basically becomes the White City of God, becomes Camelot. So you fast forward sort of 400 years, Arthur's in the same place as those things are happening.
Yeah.
So that makes perfect sense. He doesn't just wake up one Christmas and think, it might be a good idea to go looking for a Grail. Oh, what's a Grail? It's not like that. It's not like you see it in the stories. He already knew all that background from being a kid.
Yeah.
He grew up with it. And Chester, wow, what an I can't go on enough about Chester. The amphitheater where the first martyrs were martyred. It's got the round table, Tabulus Rotundus, which is this big round building in the middle of it. Nowhere else in the Roman world's got that. It's got a gigantic baths complex that becomes a palace for a Dark Age noble. It's got the biggest military supply base and the biggest military Principia capital building anywhere in Britain. It's the centre of 3 of the Roman military provinces out of the 4 that make up Roman Britannia. It's just, you look at it and you think, hang on, the Romans were up to something here. It's a no-brainer. That is Camelot. Yeah. It'd be ridiculous for anybody in 500 AD not to take over that as a capital. There's no Winchester, which the Saxons built. There's no London, which the Vikings developed. There's not even Viraconium, which is this massive Roxeter, this big Roman thing that's been put forward as Camelot. Even that's nonsense because it's just a big town. Yeah. It's not like Chester. It's not that kind of scale. Mm-hmm. Chester, I think the Romans were trying to equal Constantinople, Istanbul. They were, that's the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. I think Chester was the capital of the Western Roman Empire, and Rome is basically bang in the middle. Yeah. And that's what they were up to. Yeah. So, that comes out in the book as well. Oh, hang on a minute. I've just sunk London.
I was going to say.
I just sank that as capital city as well. You can see how things have been reappropriated, can't you? You know what I mean?
Of course. I mean, this is the thing about the whole. A lot of Arthur's story, it has just been moved around to fit whoever wanted to tell it, really, Mark, over the years. And I think Chester is one of those places, as you've just touched on there. I'm still mystified as to how little relevance some people give Chester and its importance in Britain in its early days of the Roman occupation. Well, you say occupation, they kind of just came in. I think the term often gets misidentified as an invasion, where they just basically arrived more than invaded. I think obviously there was a few skirmishes further down the country, but it seemed to be quite a harmonious relationship throughout the period of the Roman Empire's power extending this far across.
Yeah, I mean, as an archaeologist, I know that they were already here before they invaded. Yes. And there's a perfect logic is that you're not going to invade a country unless you already know that there's something there worth invading.
Yes.
So they were already here. They were trading wool, they were trading gold, silver, lead, resources of all kinds, copper. They were here. They were already here, So when they decided to invade in inverted commas, Julius Caesar came, saw and went home again because his ships got wrecked the first time in 55 BC. Yeah. And then in 54 BC when he got here, and he got 70 miles inland and then did a load of peace treaties, then went home. Then the Romans didn't come back for nearly 100 years. They were terrified, absolutely terrified of the Celtic culture. So you can kind of see that. And then they kind of moved the way. They've already done so much groundwork before they start moving the way up the country.
Yes.
But it's interesting. I mean, I think it was it Trajan and the guy beginning with V? It's gone out of my head. Anyway, there were 2 Roman emperors that were particularly involved in founding Chester, and basically both of them had just come back from campaigning in Jerusalem. So you kind of look at Chester and you think, what did they have in their minds? What was going through their minds when they got here? Because just down the road, literally a day's walking distance down the road is Joseph of Arimathea and his first church.
Yeah.
So the connections, I would love to have a time machine.
Yeah.
And just go back. Vespasian, that was the Roman emperor. Go back to the time when Vespasian decided to get his measuring tape out and kind of lay out Chester. I'd love to go back and see what he was up to and what was in his mind.
Yeah.
And then again, lo and behold, 400 years later, King Arthur comes, Arthur, the Duke of Battles, comes walking into Chester, and goes, oh, this is amazing, because obviously he would have known, it wasn't a million miles away from when it was constructed.
Yeah.
In fact, it's true to say that when the Normans got here in 1072, after harrying the north, when William the Conqueror rode into Chester, most of the buildings, vast majority of the buildings, would still have been there for someone to point them out to him.
Yeah.
We lose these crossovers over time. So that's another service that the book does. It puts things back and you can see how one thread, one flow, flows into another and flows into another and flows into another, and it does make sense. I mean, it's a good piece of history when you get into it.
Absolutely, and I think as well, this is one of those aspects. You can see this throughout history in the UK, Mark, where churches and religious buildings have been built adjacent to or on top of existing religious sites throughout history. One of the ones that's most forward in my mind is obviously Rudston in East Yorkshire, where they've got the monolith there, which is clearly a deeply symbolic site for those peoples thousands of years ago, next to a massive church and also a Roman burial site. So you've got this trio of important artifacts that are literally, they're all in, I mean, the Roman burial is in the graveyard, which hosts the monolith next to the church. So,
well, there's an interesting story I can throw in that's not in the book, because I was on the archaeological dig for Chester Amphitheater when we were doing Lost Treasures, and they've never really found anything to say why Chester was where Chester is.
Yes.
But then all of a sudden, when they started going down through the layers of the amphitheater, they came literally straight onto this gigantic roundhouse, the remains of a Celtic roundhouse, and next to that was a sort of a piece of farming ground, if you like, and in the farming ground you could see these footprints of somebody leading an oxen away. So it was like they'd come in, the Romans had come in, and there must have already been a settlement there. It must have already been cleared. The top of the hill was clearly prime, real estate. And what they'd done is they'd gone in and asked these Iron Age villagers or whatever to up sticks and go. And there in the mud was the last footprints of, some little lad wandering off with this aurochs cow, leaving the tracks. And then they just buried the lot under the amphitheater. So there was definitely something already there. So you're absolutely correct. They're building layers, one layer on top of another. Well, the amphitheater eventually becomes the cemetery for St. John's, which is Anglo-Saxon. And so on and so on. The whole thing just flows in the same way.
I've always found things like that deeply interesting because there's clearly a significance, and as we've touched on about utilising history and rewriting it for personal promotion or propaganda, Mark, that this has gone on in all kinds of fields over the years, and this is just a continuation of it, regardless of whether we talk about Romans or Christianity or Celts or Picts. They all understood the symbolism of culture, regardless.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's a need for, it's a big word, this, contextualisation. In other words, when historians are doing work, they need to put the history in context. So in other words, you've first of all got to get your locations right, your dates right, but more importantly, the context, the culture, the background. You've got to read around what you're dealing with, because what we tend to do is, as you rightly say, we get our ideas and we impose them on the past. Well, that's not right. It's not correct. It's not academically right. It's not historically right. It's not archaeologically right. And so many Arthurian scholars don't pay enough attention to the dates. The dates are so important. They would just save themselves so much trouble if they just contextualize what they're doing. What were people doing at the time when Arthur was here? They weren't riding round in shiny Gothic plate armor, hitting each other with maces and jousting and saving maidens from dragons. They weren't doing that. Do you know what I mean? They were in a post-Roman collapsed apocalyptic situation where everybody was a threat to everybody else. It was all territorial and they were all fighting each other. So it completely changes it. It puts it in a different arena. So that's the key to it. All I've done really with the book is contextualize stuff, is put it into the order that it should be in.
Yeah, and I think that's how it should be. And as we were talking about the link between Joseph and everything, would you say this is where the germ of these stories of quests comes from? Because obviously this is something else down the line that becomes an important part of the legend of Arthur and his knights which essentially was his warrior's mark. That would they have had this idea of history, whereas people now think of these quests as going out and searching for monsters and rescuing people, whereas when we look back at it, they were probably just going to visit archaeological and important sites?
It's slightly more complicated than that, in a sense that questing as a thing had already been around quite a long time by then. The idea of going searching for relics, I mean, if you imagine, Christ is crucified in the 1st century AD, well, that's like the equivalent of from here to Elizabeth I, Elizabethan, from Arthur. So between that happening, the days of Joseph and then Arthur coming along, questing was already underway, and especially for swords. A lot of prominent characters who had swords, you'll find them popping up everywhere. The swords get handed down. They become these sacred objects. Crowns get handed down. So the same thing's true of sacred objects. So it's not new. By the time you arrive at Arthur, it's not a new occupation. What gives it the added push, though, with Arthur, basically, he comes to the throne. He's an enthusiastic teenager. He's got a job to do, and he gets out there and he kicks ass. And he kicks ass for a long time. He goes on campaign. He deals with loads of problems, gets rid of the enemies, solidifies everything. Eventually ends up with the right woman on the 3rd go, marries, settles down, all the rest of it. He's got a solid family, a solid base, solid area. He's sat there with 260 knights, 24 of them sat round a 12-compartment round table, and they're all sat there and they're all looking at each other going, okay, what do we do now? What do we do now, lads? If we don't come up with something to do, we're not going to stay in power very long. I know what, we'll go on quests. So that's what you find is the second half, if you like, the last bit of Arthur's life, is this idea of going off finding stuff. And you're right, it's kind of a sort of primitive form of archaeology, I suppose, where the chase is better than the catch. And except in Arthur's day, there's always a punchline, there's always kind of a point to it. That's not to say that at the end of Arthur's life, he didn't have to pick up the sword and go off and kick ass again, because he gets called upon to join in the last of the Roman wars over on the continent. That's when it goes horribly wrong. Mordred takes over. And that's where we get Camlan and the end of his life. But the idea of questing, it doesn't even stop with Arthur. It carries on. And I would venture to say even today, people are still questing. They're still going looking for stuff. Yeah, it's been like that. I think it's something in humanity. It's in us as human beings to want to have that excitement of going, and it's the Indiana Jones syndrome, like we mentioned when we were off air at the beginning. This idea of going off and searching for stuff. It's that kind of whole concept and the excitement of doing that. I mean, me as an archaeologist, when I find stuff, the chase is definitely better than the catch. I've not found anything particularly valuable. I've found millions of objects and sites and, artifacts and what have you. And I just love the chase and that connection with the past. But then once you've done that and it's all been, photographed, catalogued, written down, published, all that, you move on. You move on. And Arthur was no different. Arthur and his knights were just the same. And that's where the questing comes from. There's loads and loads of quests that are covered in the book. So, yeah, they're definitely in there. They're worth a look. They're definitely worth a look.
Absolutely. Well, I think the one person we've yet to touch on, really, which we're doing him a bit of a disservice. Or I say him, I mean them, I would say, is Merlin. Now, once again, here we have the modern interpretation of this is this wizard with magic powers and all-seeing eyes and everything, and yet when we look at his factual reality, Merlin was probably the last of the druids, was he not, Mark?
Yes. I would perhaps describe him as a classical period scientist more than anything. If you know that you're looking at something that is a druidic title, which is Merlin, you end up with the Merlins, and I think I've got 6 of them listed in the book. And they're all listed in the records, so we know they exist. There's Merlin Taliesin, Merlin Ambrosius, Merlin Lalogan, Merlin Willett, Merlin Tortugan, and then another one whose name I can't remember, but there's a last one which I think he ended up, it's some weird Irish name because I think he finishes up in Ireland. Yes. But the first one, Taliesin, everybody knows is a poet. Second one, Ambrosius, is Uther Pendragon's elder brother, but he was an extremely godly and clever man and a military leader. Next one, Merlin Le Logan, he's the one that kicks Arthur off. He's there for the first half of Arthur's life up to the Battle of Baden. And he's really wise. He's really, really clever, very much in the Pythagorean scholar, Greek scholar kind of mode. But he lives to a colossal age. He lives to something like 103. But then he gets taken over by Merlin Willett. Now, Merlin Willett has to watch Arthur go wrong, if you like, and everything Arthur's built collapse. So he does end up in the woods and he does go mad, and he's the one that's quite famous and dies in his 80s. But he dies up in Cumbria, so he moves north. And then the last one, Tertuggen, is a poet that's up there in Cumbria and in the lowlands of Scotland. And they're titles. It's a title. The Merlin is the most prominent of all of these characters amongst the Welsh Britons. That having been said, if you want to know what the Druids were like, again, you've got to go back to the authentic sources, and there are precious few of them, if I'm being honest. If you were to write them all down and list them and just do sort of, bullet points, you'd have a couple of pages of A4 and that'd be it. But the Romans, thankfully, wrote enough down for us to be able to deduce that these guys, followed Pythagoras. They were stargazers. They, read the omens. There were so many things about them that would have certainly made them appear magical. These guys could have turned around and gone, behold, an eclipse. Boom, the sun turns off. Yes. And everyone's like, whoa, how the hell did they do that? Well, they did that because they had a calendar, we've got two of the calendars, and they're lunar. They're lunar cycle calendars. So they would have been able to follow that. Of course they would. It's almost like the sum total of the ancient world, resides certainly in European culture with them. So it kind of ends at them. It ends with the Merlins. But, it's like Christianity's been around 2,000 years. Well, at the point when Merlin was alive, Druidism was at least 3,500 years old. Yes. If not 4,000. It stretched all the way back into the Bronze Age. So, it's not unusual for those people to appear to ordinary people as being extremely, extremely magical. Throw in a bit of herbalism and a bit of chemistry, and a bit of theatre, and you've got yourself a wizard. That's what they look like, Can you imagine that? You're a wizard, Merlin. It's one of these. I'm sure people will get the name check there. But yes, that's what we end up with, and that's our concept in it. It's contextualizing. We're modernizing. We're creating a modern character. I think I've come fairly close to getting him with. Pythagoras did the golden verses. Yes, and there's a guy called Hecataeus translated them. In about 400 AD. So there was this translation of the golden verses kicking around about the time Merlin was born. So sooner or later, I'm sure he would have got to read them. And that is actually in the book. So if you want to read the sort of stuff Merlin would have read, it's there. It's in the book. You can see where he was coming from.
I think it's also very interesting in regards to this connection with the Druids, because I think often people have an idea that the Druids had essentially been eradicated by this point in time, Mark. But clearly, as one would expect, as we see throughout history and around the world, sometimes you just can't crush things. They will hide away until they think it's safe to return.
Well, yeah, and it was said that if you wanted to become a Druid, like a real hardcore, the most perfect Druid on planet Earth, the Romans said if you want to become that, you have to come to Britain to learn. Yeah. So we were the world's number one for Druids, and the Druids tended to meet in the centre of the landmass. So that would put them within stone's throw of Chester and the Wirral. Yeah. So not only have you got the first Christians up here and the biggest Roman port and what have you, city up here, you've got the Druids up here as well. So it makes perfect sense when the Romans invaded that they sort of came up here and went druid bashing. You know, they went in search of the druids and tried to wipe them out, force them onto Anglesey. But there's this point where there must have been a combination of Christianity and Druidry, and it must have happened here. Because if you then examine where the church goes, you'll suddenly find that a lot of stuff that would have been Druidic quite clearly ends up as becoming the church. And I'm not saying that lightly. I mean, it's everything from the colours of the altar cloths to the seasons to the saints to where they build the churches, to the fact that churches look like groves with their Gothic, you know, overarching branches and all what have you, the alignments to the stars, north, south, east, west and all the rest of it. Absolutely everything that constitutes what we view now as a church has its origins outside of the Bible. So you're like, wow, okay, that must have been a real, you know, first century merger. Because, I mean, the Romans, you know, you couldn't be a Roman citizen if you were a Christian because you were a religious dissident. Yeah. You couldn't be a Roman citizen if you were a Druid because you were a political dissident. Yeah. And they never stopped asking people to rise up and fight the Romans. They never stopped. So the last of the Druids, effectively, you could say, are the last of the Merlins. The whole thing dies, if you like. It fades out with the arrival of the Saxons. So the last of the proper hardcore Druids die out somewhere around 600 AD. That's when they disappear. But it's because they just no longer have the same function that they once did.
Yeah. Well, I think the last two characters we need to touch on, really, are probably two of the most important names you would associate with the modern version of Arthur, Mark, which are obviously Guinevere and Lancelot. So what's their real history? Because obviously, I mean, Lancelot seems to be one of those that turns up a lot later than everybody else, really.
Yeah, he really does come late to the party. There is a reason for that. Some people think that in the original warband there was a guy called Lancelin, and this character does pop up. But to say he has a minor role is understating it. He's virtually non-existent. He just gets a mention, and that's that. Because in the early tales, the knight par excellence is Gawain. You've got to look at Sir Gawain. He is the knight, the number one knight. So Lancelot really doesn't appear, like you say, till medieval times, and it could be that that's a medieval mark of respect, if you like, for Lancelot having ownership of places like Lancashire, Cheshire, possibly parts of Derbyshire, the Pennines. Lancelot was certainly here. It became, Lancelot's Shire, which is what Lancashire is. Yeah. And all his sites are up here. So obviously there was a character, possibly Linus as well, which was the Roman guy that ran this area, who then founds, if you like, the dynasty of Lancelot that follows. But he is very much a medieval invention. So bit of a love interest, something that the chivalry lot can get the teeth into. But nah, I'm afraid he's not really there in the early legends. Guinevere is a different kettle of fish altogether. She's gone the opposite way. She was at one point the number one character. Yeah. Everything revolved around Guinevere, who ruled, battles, where they went, what they did. It was all Guinevere's doing. She's kind of crucial to Arthur's life, if you like. That's why he puts a couple of other mistresses and his first wife puts them away and basically marries Guinevere for her queenship, because the Pictish Scots rule through their queens, and her family line certainly comes from up in the Edinburgh region. So when she comes down and she marries Arthur, all the Picts, who at this point are settled in all of southern Scotland, Lancashire, coming all the way down into the Mersey Valley, Derbyshire, North Wales, they're all settled in that area. They all then take Arthur's side. So really, Arthur would be absolutely nothing without his Guinevere. She's a huge character. And in later romances and later stories, they kind of water her down. She becomes Lancelot's love interest, and she's in the background. She's more of a sidekick. Yeah. And she's the typical sort of, how can I put it, wet and weedy medieval maiden in distress. Yes. And it's like, that's not what she was. She was a proper hardcore Pictish queen. She's very modern in the way she deals with things. As soon as she thinks Arthur's dead, she marries his son. She shacks up with Mordred. It's like, the old man's gone, we'll have this one. He'll do. And that's what gets her into trouble.
Yeah.
Because she ends up, siding with Mordred, and then all of a sudden Arthur turns up. Damn, he's still alive. That's blown it. What can I do now? So I've got this image of her kind of, sneaking out of Chester with a handmaiden just before the Battle of Camlan. She gets the hell out of Dodge and she basically flees back to Scotland, but it doesn't work out terribly well for her because her Picts, her tribe, are not fooled. And it's said that they kept things like big cats, leopards and panthers and things like that. They used to keep them as pets.
Yeah.
And basically, as she's approaching the hill fort, they just set the cats on her and she gets torn to pieces. So it's a bit of a gruesome end, but it's judgment. It's basically them passing judgment on a failed queen. She failed. She didn't stay true to Arthur.
Yeah.
She should really have, stepped up and taken control in his absence and not taken no for an answer. But I think that's where you get this idea that she can have an affair with Lancelot later on, because she was very much like that. She was extremely vain, full of a position, and not above, bedding someone else if she thought it was worth it. And that's where she gets that terrible reputation from. So she, if anything, she's reduced. So Lancelot gets blown up out of all proportion and she kind of gets diminished, which is a real shame. It's, just as a note, by the way, as well, when I was doing the book, I had to laugh because Arthur's got a type. When you read the Welsh legends, his 3 wives are so similar that they very often get mixed up. And they're known as the 3 Guineveres or the 3 White Phantoms because he's got this type, of these kind of thin, wispy, blonde-haired, shiny white-skinned women. He's really got a type. So all 3 of them very often get mixed up. So I just had to laugh. I thought, typical man, definitely got a type. loves his blondes,
Well, it's a fantastic work, Mark. I have to say, I've learnt more reading that than I garnered in my previous life in regards to Arthur and his true history. As we've touched on, towards the back of the book, you've got a full list of all your historical documents, chronologically listed, the references, the overview. So everything we've discussed, these are not theories or pulling things out of the air or wishing history to be true. These are historically documented works that you have gone through and sifted through and pulled together that anybody can then go, as you've said in the book several times, this is a stepping stone for wider knowledge, and people can use it as a bridging point into the rest of it, because even just by our conversation today, we've essentially just skimmed the whole history, really.
I mean, that's the point of the book, really, because it's frustrating now because you've literally got every piece of information you could possibly want on the internet. Go and have a look at it online. How many times do people say that? And I'm writing this King Arthur book and I'm thinking, but people don't even know where to start.
Yes.
So that list, that actual last bit is, possibly one of the most important things, because it's a springboard to the next step. And I'm quite sure if people get hold of this book, people will continue to write academically and historically sound material from the stuff that's listed in the back, because I just couldn't get it all in. Like you say, 488 pages. It just wasn't big enough. But, I didn't want to completely annihilate everybody. I have to say it's not as big as the Bible, and it's not as big as Lord of the Rings or War and Peace. It's not impossible. I mean, a couple of friends of mine have read it within a couple of days. Don't ask me how, but they have. So it's not impossible. But yes, that idea of pulling it all together. The last section, actually, which is called The Legend, that's my nod to academia, really, I suppose. The first 4 sections are an easy read, but you can't do a book like this and not put something serious in. And that's what that end bit is.
Absolutely. Mark, where can everybody get a hold of a copy of this book? And
I'll do the usual adverts, okay? If you want to buy anything at all, by me, Amazon. Go to Amazon. It's all on Amazon. I think there's about 9 books on there now. And certainly the ones I've done recently with Philip have been they're audio books as well, except this one, because we haven't finished reading it to audio yet, so it's going to take a while. But they're certainly all available on Kindle, paperback, hardback. They're all there. They're all on Amazon. Type my name in. And you'll get it. It's there. If you want to contact me, I'm on Facebook. Send me a friend request or whatever. If you want to message me, there's Messenger. You can contact me through that.
Fabulous. Mark, it's always lovely to catch up with you once again. I know this is the second time we've spoken. This book really has opened my eyes and given me a real thirst to find out far more than I ever thought I'd want to. Because, as you say, it's such a mess and you just don't know where to start with it, that reading this and understanding it far more than I ever did has really helped. So I wish you the very best of luck with it. No doubt I hope we will speak again, and I wish you the very best of luck for the rest of the year, sir.
And the same to you. Thank you for having me.